Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this Democracy Forum debate, where we will try to define the fault lines in China's internal economic policies. Fault lines which, if not corrected, could erupt in a way that shakes the world and impacts all our lives. The pact between the Communist Party and China's citizens is that in exchange for keeping quiet about who governs them and how, their standard of living and the economy will keep getting better and better. What, though, if that doesn't happen? To debate this critical issue, we have a superb panel of specialists: Jin Sun, George Magnus, Yuka Kobayashi. Each will give a short 3-minute overview, and then we will drill down into specific areas. But first, as always, in our Democracy Forum debates, I will ask our President, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the canvas and background of our discussions. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to a new season of recorded panel events, which the Democracy Forum is hosting. The emergence of China's plan to avoid a deflationary trap is a topic of great relevance, and I congratulate the team at TDF for inviting a panel of leading commentators to expose the critical economic issues facing the administration of Xi Jinping. I look forward to their presentations and to the discussion which will follow. And I thank Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator today. In an article published at the start of April, The Economist magazine referred to the current challenges facing China as the gravest economic test since the most far-reaching of Deng Xiaoping's reforms of the 1990s. China's prospects are diminished by a shrinking workforce expected to reduce by 20% in the next 25 years, while the systemic crisis in the property market, which drives a fifth of GDP, will take years to resolve. Debt reduction plans have been forced on 10 provinces by the State Council, China's cabinet, to curb expenditure on public infrastructure, while a further 19 regions have been notified to report their most indebted cities. With economic growth sluggish, lackluster consumer demand has pushed the domestic economy into a deflationary spiral, persisting for 3 quarters in a row. Foreign direct investment has fallen to its lowest level since 1993, while China's benchmark stock index, CSI, has lost 32% since the start of 2021. Against this sobering background, President Xi addressed delegates at the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference last month, outlining a program which is being referred to by Chinese officials as, I quote, new productive forces, emphasizing technological innovation to improve productivity and investing in manufacturing to strengthen self-reliance, thus continuing a strategy to utilize foreign technology to establish local industries that become internationally dominant. Some commentators are suggesting that what President Xi really wants is for China to be leader of the next industrial revolution, requiring it to upgrade traditional industries, break foreign strangleholds on existing technologies, and forge a new path in industries of the future. But this goal is likely to be thwarted by the reluctance of China's consumers to spend, by the historic underachievement of productivity, and by the growing alarm of China's trading partners at the prospect of their domestic industries being undermined by the dumping of manufactured goods as China seeks to export its deflation. Indeed, such a plan cannot succeed without the help of local governments, which are short of cash, and private entrepreneurs, who are short of confidence, concludes The Economist. Evidently, President Xi is determined to reinvent China's economy, and to do so, he needs to reinflate it first. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And please pass any questions or comments that you have to the chair.
Lord Bruce, thank you for that gravest economic test and determined to reinvent China's economy. Can it be done? Can you do it? Can an authoritarian power become a Western-style market successful economy? Our first panelist is Dr. Xin Sun, Senior Lecturer in Chinese and East Asian Business at King's College London. Widely published, his one focus has been authoritarian politics and political economy of development. Where are those fault lines? How dangerous are they? Dr. Xin Sun, tell us what you know.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, for your invitation and a kind introduction. So let me start by putting forward my central argument first. The economic challenges we're seeing in China today, in my opinion, is not really because of the few missteps we have seen committed by the government over the past few years. It's not just about the real estate bubble. Of course, the massive real estate bubble and its burst was part of it. And neither it was only about the pandemic, but rather I would argue it's actually the result of the economic growth model China had long relied on over the past few decades, right? So for the sake of simplicity, let me just call this the China model. But this can be a very misleading term because the essence of this model is not really unique to China, but rather it has been adopted repeatedly again and again in earlier examples. For example, like Germany in the late 19th centuries, and also Japan and other East Asian countries during the post-war period. So if we look at the essence of this China model, there are obviously two pillars. One is a strong developmental state, and the other is a vibrant, dynamic, and efficient private sector. The development state basically extracts the resources from the society and turn them into effective investment in public goods, in education, and infrastructure. Then it's a private sector that actually mobilize all these resources and take advantage of the domestic cheap labor and the capital and use the technology developed by other countries and compete in the global market. Right. However, this model has some intrinsic problem, is that at some point, its productivity growth hit a stagnation. And after that, after the stagnation, you will see all the countries that adopted this model will rely on stimulated demand, such as debts or war. So again, this is what happened in Germany during the interwar period, and this is what happened in Japan after 1990s. So coming back to China, you see that the data tells us that from around mid-2000, especially in the wake of the global financial crisis, the productivity in Chinese economy has stagnated. And the impressive record China has achieved after that is basically driven by the accumulation of massive debt in the forms of like real estate debts, local government debts, and debts accrued to the state-owned enterprises, right? The problem is that this model is fragile, it's vulnerable towards crisis. And this is a familiar story we know. Over the past few years, the combination of the pandemic, the misconceived policies against the real estate sector and also the private sector collectively triggered this crisis. But to say that China hit the stagnation point in around mid-2000, it's a little bit surprising to many of us. Even if we draw the analogy between China and Japan, you see the level of development in China in mid-2000 was still very far behind the level achieved in Japan in around, let's say, 1990s, right? So that means China still had a very strong potential to continue with healthy and sustainable growth. Then what happened, why China achieved this premature stagnation, in my term, like I think it's quite premature, right? I think the answer to that have to do with the policy choices made by the government after 2000, not just under Xi Jinping's era, but also under Hu Jintao's era as well. Okay.
Thank you. No, that's fascinating. Could you just inject into that one thought? I think I put it at the beginning. You mentioned Japan, you mentioned Germany, that to what extent is the freeing up of civil society involved in this idea that an authoritarian dictatorship, whatever you want to call it, cannot develop until it frees up? Is that a factor or not?
Well, the thing is that if we look at these earlier cases, either Germany, in late 19th centuries, or Japan in 1960s and the 70s, you would see, both of them didn't have a very strong civil society. There were some elements of it, but they were not most famous for their development of civil society. And actually, there can be an argument to be made like that. The strong state actually imposed some sort of control over the society, and that allows the economy to gain some advantages. Just one example, if you look at Japan never had this very strong developed labor union system. Most of the labor unions were actually established at the corporate level rather than at the sector level or national level. So this actually gives the Japanese corporates a lot of advantages of resisting some of the wage demand from their labor unions. And of course, that also applies to current China, but to a more extreme status.
That's interesting. Of course, both of those countries gave examples ended up being the aggressors in a war, but we can maybe get to that, because now we turn to the wisdom and expertise of author and economist George Magnus, who has a reputation for prescience. He forecast the 2008 financial crisis. He's served as chief economist to S.G. Warburg and the UBS Investment Bank, and his latest book is the telling title, Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. Why is that, George Magnus? Tell us what you know.
Well, thank you, Humphrey, for having me here. And I think one of the problems about having a very insightful introduction from Lord Bruce and excellent analysis from my co-panelist here is I'm just kind of left to fill in a few holes, actually. But I certainly agree with pretty much everything that they've said, and so I'd just like to kind of frame it perhaps just slightly differently, but really along the same lines. And I think it's quite right to say that the struggle which I think Xi Jinping and the party have with China's development model, I mean, it's not obviously just since COVID. It's been brewing for some time, certainly going back into the 2000s, but it has become dysfunctional. And it is presenting with systemic headwinds, which I think have now become pretty consensus. When I wrote Red Flags just 5 or 6 years ago, I mean, some of these things were still quite controversial, but the debt capacity of the economy, the demographics of China's population and working age population, the stall in productivity, the weakness of domestic demand, not because the government isn't stimulating the economy, because it has a model and a philosophy which actually is geared towards what they call supply side reforms, which are basically expanding production and expanding the output of China's big firms, rather than in trying to do something to better the income structure of the economy, which would fuel better consumption. So I think the leadership knows that they've reached a kind of a turn or a fork in the road. My belief is that they've decided that the old school model of stimulating the economy through real estate and infrastructure spending is reached the end of the road. Can't do that. And they're not going to basically embrace liberal or market kind of reforms as we would, or the IMF might kind of recommend. And so this is where these so-called new productive forces come in. So this is strongly rooted in Marxist thinking. It's not just who wants to be the top dog in science and technology, which we all do. But I think from a CCP point of view, it's really about societal development, modernization, political structure in the country achieved through gains in science and technology. Unfortunately, and we can talk about this perhaps a little bit in discussion, I think what the government is doing is conflating two things which are diametrically opposite. It is basically thinks that industrial policy and innovation are the same thing, whereas in fact industrial policy, think about it as a kind of a vertical concept, which is about picking winners, industries, sectors, and innovation is much more of a horizontal concept, where you actually create laws, regulations, competition environment, business environment, in which all industries, even the boring ones in society, get benefits. So I think China, obviously, let's not be churlish, it has islands of technological excellence and leadership, which it will continue to have, I'm sure, in the future. But I'm not sure that these will be the answer to the questions or the objectives and aspirations which the government has.
That's fascinating. It's one thing, if I can follow up on it. We're talking about identifying fault lines. You mentioned deeply rooted in Marxist ideology. Of course, that ideology had never had to confront the practical situation that China is in today when it was being practiced formally in China. How much is that a help or a hindrance to what China's trying to achieve?
Well, of course, the circumstances under which Marx and indeed Stalin much later were kind of grappling with how to create and manage these productive forces. I mean, productive forces includes labor as well. We're quite different, but there is a sort of a sinicized version of this, which is very well articulated in official documents, but the party publishes, and the way it teaches Xi Jinping thought in schools, universities, workplaces, communities, and so on. The central problem or the central issue is the same, really. It's about how these productive forces are created, managed, implemented to change society. But the question is, if you think about things like steam, electricity, the internet, GPS, I mean, these what we call general purpose technologies are not created really by industrial policy, but by creating an environment in which they flourish.
And of course, they've got companies like Huawei, which is quite ahead of the game. Fascinating, George Magnus, thank you very much. Now we are going to turn to Yuka Kobayashi, a specialist in China and international politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She has written widely about China's human rights, the Belt and Road, the World Trade Organization, and more. And she's coming to us remotely. I'm not quite sure where, facilitated no doubt because of the gadgets from China, so how would we live without that? What would we do without them? Yuka Kobayashi, where are those fault lines? Give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to share some of my thoughts with you today. I think various fault lines in the Chinese economy have been covered. For example, real estate, local government, FDI, deflation. But one other aspect I really want to focus upon, which I think really encapsulates the macro areas where this kind of Chinese economy is going, is geopolitics. And geopolitics is kind of an area we're actually seeing more and more intertwined with the economy, given that we have sort of terms like economic security, supply chain resilience. And this is very much coming from what China is doing domestically and what China is doing in its industrial policies. And I think what we're actually seeing here is really the driving forces around China's economy really dictated by geopolitics, and also having this kind of reverse kind of influence on geopolitics, and also concurrently around norms. And I think my previous speakers have actually talked about how, the economy is actually functioning around ways in which we understand how economic sort of activity should be functioning, be it regulation, be it competition, etc. So I think where we're actually seeing is really kind of the geopolitics and the economy, actually the competition between very different camps around authoritarian ideas and also democratic ideas. Like, for example, if you actually take Huawei or TikTok, we're actually seeing sort of areas in which we have very different ideas about norms around which, the economy should function. How should we actually deal with trade and services? How should we deal with data? And I think a lot of these things actually show a really emerging divide and fault lines emerging coming from China, but also having an impact globally in terms of fault lines around how we should think about economic governance. And so I think here we're actually seeing very diverging ideas in which the economy should function. And we saw this emerge around when China joined the WTO. We had very different kinds of ideas around what is a market economy, what is a socialist market economy. And we're also seeing, the discussion around China model. But if we take the kind of geopolitical view, the China dream, so the ideas around how we should actually function the economy and how we should actually trade are being projected along the Belt and Road Initiative through this idea of a China dream, which is very central to the ideas and philosophies around Xi Jinping. And I think given that we're actually seeing a very geopolitically charged kind of economy, not just in China. If you look at even in Brussels, we have a geopolitical commission, right? So it is actually kind of reflecting the times, as you can see, that we're seeing not a globalizing economy, but we're actually seeing something, a backtrack of that. And we're seeing a turning point where we're not really talking about globalization anymore. We're talking about supply chain resilience. And this is very much intertwined with what she's been doing around sort of areas around sort of like rare earths and, PPE around the pandemic. So we're seeing a real interesting kind of fault line emerge geopolitically in the economy globally, which is also impacting what China's doing domestically, but also reflecting what China's doing domestically in terms of, what we're talking about industrial policies. To be number one in sort of in technology and science, we're actually seeing very much, things like Made in China 2025, China Standards 2030. We're seeing China trying to kind of rewrite their background in sort of standard setting around the economy. So this is very much entwined with where things are going geopolitically, which is something that I think, my previous speakers haven't actually touched upon, but which is very much linked with where things are going China globally and how this kind of reflects where China is going domestically. So how does this tie in with Xi Jinping? So if you see very earlier on in the pandemic, we see Xi talking about how he wants the world to rely on the Chinese economy, so the global supply chains to rely on China. And this is precisely what we actually see with China, how things evolved during the pandemic. And this is where we actually see a shift in terms of how we understand economy. And it's kind of having an interesting impact on norms. So, for example, when we talk about democracy and authoritarianism, it's very much linked with a lot of discussions in political economy. But also, I think if you also look at governance models, the norms around how economy should function, more and more we're actually seeing digital. Like, for example, I'm joining you online. So a lot of things are becoming much more on the digital platform. So which really brings together very interesting ways in which how the economy should actually function on online sort of surfaces and where we have different modes of understanding how kind of we should actually deal with norms. So this is kind of a different angle to what a lot of my colleagues have actually presented early on, mainly because I don't have much to add to the brilliant presentations that my colleagues actually did before me, but I merely wanted to paint a picture of where China's going globally with it, the economic fault lines.
That is great. Thank you for bringing that perspective in. Can I just clarify a couple of things with you? Because George Magnus talked about that infrastructure element there hitting a wall. Has the Belt and Road hit a wall, or is that still beneficial for China?
That's an interesting question. It depends where you pitch that question to. I think the Belt and Road Initiative has actually definitely seen better days. There's a lot of pushback domestically, also in terms of specific countries and host nations that host, like for example, Indonesia has pushed back quite a lot against Belt and Road Initiative. But for example, similarly in Southeast Asia, you have very different kinds of perceptions around it, around Myanmar and Cambodia. So it depends where you pitch the question. But domestically, you're actually seeing more and more questioning in terms of where are the funds going? Why should we be building these roads and ports abroad when we have so much demand for different resources domestically in terms of infrastructure. And given that, we also see like Xinjiang, which was one of the key things that, in terms of economic policy, one of the key headaches that previous administrations had was how to develop that kind of develop West. Zhou brought that out in the early 2000s to really develop that region in the West, which was really left behind all the economic miracles that you saw domestically throughout China, especially in the coastal regions in the East. But now we're actually seeing a very different kind of issue around the West, not just in terms of economic development, but we're actually seeing very difficulties around human rights issues. So essentially, I think this idea of connecting the West with Central Asia and beyond, that's actually seeing better days, given that we also see the big gap with Russia and Ukraine and the sanctions around that, and that gap that you actually see with connectivity. What connectivity do we have in the Belt and Road, given that we have, the issue around Ukraine and the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Road in, we have the issues around Middle East.
I like it. It's seen better days. It's still around, but it's seen better days. Because I remember in 2017, I think Xi Jinping was at the Davos World Economic Forum, and everybody was enraptured by what he said, and the Economist was saying this is the future, and now we're having a completely different discussion. I'd like to spend a few minutes drilling down in three areas, just amongst the three of you in general discussion here. The first one is domestically. I was taken by what George Magnus said about the Marxist ideology, and we've talked real estate and all this other stuff. George, kick us off with that. Domestically, let's get a little bit further into what the fault lines are.
Well, where to begin? I mean, we have covered the territory. I think the principal fault line, I think, is twofold, really. I mean, they are related. The first is that the capacity of China to continue to grow by increasing its debt more than its GDP is growing.
The debt issue there.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, a lot of the problems in economics worldwide and historically are distributional issues, right? Like who is going to pay is the kind of central issue. I mean, we have this in the United Kingdom, we have it all over Europe and all over the emerging world as well.
So let's just focus, Jin's on the debt issue. Is that a big fault line? Is that what we should focus on?
Yes, of course. That's indeed a very big fault line, because relying on debt growth is very fragile. It's very dangerous. We have seen that.
And Germany, would they?
And also United States, in 2008, which George correctly predicted. The thing is that if we look at the deep root of where the debt issue comes from, again, it boils down to the incapacity of the Chinese economy to grow in terms of productivity.
Yeah.
Right? If there were productivity growth, if the Chinese product could have been more competitive both domestically and globally, China didn't have to rely that much on debt, on local government debt, on real estate.
Then, George, you want to jump in?
The two central issues that the Chinese government has to grapple with this decade is who's going to pay for the real estate bust, right? This is not just a kind of a cyclical problem that, with a little bit of tinkering is going to go away. And we know to our own cost in developed countries that when you hit the wall with a real estate bust, these are structural issues that take a long time. The costs have to be allocated, people have to pay the cost, whether it's creditors, whether it's banks. So there's a big tab to pay, and it's not clear. I mean, obviously the Chinese property developers are now under the cosh, but that's really only the kind of the start, I would say. So this is going to go on for years, I think, the shrinkage of the property market and the allocation of costs. The other big issue, which is related to this, is who's going to pay for the dysfunction in local and provincial governments, right? So local and provincial governments in China, as I think many people know, account for, something like 3/4 of total public expenditure, but they only get about 1/4 to 1/3 of total revenues. And so this is a problem which the Chinese government tried to address in 1994 with extensive local government reform, but within 5 years it was back to square one. So this is a big problem. Is how and obviously the central government in Beijing wants to keep the local governments on a leash, and it likes the idea
that gets down to the living standards element.
Yeah, because
local governments are responsible for that sort of.
They pay for goods and services. Yes. Yeah.
We've got the debt, we've got the local government distribution of resources. Yuka, your big fault lines, this is domestically we're talking about. We'll talk about geopolitics in a moment.
I think domestically, one other thing that needs to be really covered is really, if you're looking at economic slowdown, you need to also see the extremely high unemployment rate, especially around the youth, which is kind of a worrying area. If you look at sort of real estate, it is a big issue. Also, in terms of local debt, that's a big issue. But if you're looking at the health of the economy going forward, I think unemployment rate is something that you also need to really look at. 21%, that's pretty high in terms of the youth unemployment. And if you're seeing that kind of in a continuous sort of trajectory, especially since they're coming out from this kind of post-pandemic lockdown and the economic vulnerabilities, we're seeing a significant slowdown of the Chinese economy. And given that sort of economic performance is so connected to the CCP legitimacy. So, given that, if you think about sort of the Communist Party today, economics and economic performance is very much their source of legitimacy. So I think in terms of, the health of the Chinese economy, we're seeing definitely worrying kind of trends like deflation and real estate and local government. But also one thing that you can't ignore is really the unemployment rates, which is extremely high.
That's interesting. I'm just wondering, don't answer this at the moment, but how close are we to the Communist Party actually breaking that pact that I mentioned at the beginning? Because you talked about the legitimacy there. I know that they have this nuclear clock where the hand goes closer to midnight. And I just wondered if we could think about that and maybe answer it at the end. I want to move on to Xi himself now, because you mentioned, Jin-Sun, that it wasn't just him, that the policies were there. But what are his factors? I mean, we know about the threats against Taiwan, the man on the street, but also the arrests or the diminishing of the power of the tech giants and that sort of thing. Yeah. Sum up his responsibility for this.
Okay. Oh, this is a very important and yet big question. So let me bring everybody back to what China has done right during the early reform period and why China could adopt the right economic policies.
Early reform period is
1980s and the 1990s, just very briefly.
Okay.
So obviously, you saw great decentralization, privatization, and the liberalization, very dramatic in 80s and the 90s, right? And I would argue, underlying institutional foundation for this, early reform period has been a very dramatic decentralization of political power. What you saw over that period is that the local governments actually played a very important role in steering the economic activities, inviting foreign businesses coming over, providing all the friendly business environment, et cetera, et cetera.
The same local governments that are now being bled of resources.
Exactly, right? So think about why these local governments, they used to be so friendly towards businesses. It's because, they face very dramatic competition among themselves, right? If one of them decides to kill the hen and grab the egg, the hen will naturally fly away towards another jurisdiction and collaborate with another local official, right? What happened under Xi, I mean, this is not just, not completely Xi's fault, but under Xi, a dramatic change we have seen is that a great concentration of power. The power of economic management being taken away piece by piece, gradually from the local government and being concentrated into the central government.
Yuka, do you agree with that?
I think I would echo what has been said already, and I would also say that there's a great concentration of power around Xi. It's not just his cult of personality, but also in terms of economic policies. A lot of it has been concentrated around Xi, which is kind of irregular given what's been happening with the previous kind of administrations. And also in terms of like key sort of sectors and targets, I mean, much has been concentrated around Xi, which is kind of a little bit irregular given, the division there was between kind of premier and president. And so I think, you're seeing more and more kind of concentration around Xi in terms of economic sort of decision making.
So that ties in with what you were saying, is that when you take the initiative and the power away from the grassroots, put it centrally, then productivity, the whole economy falters.
There's quite a lot going on here to unwrap.
That's why I'm coming to you, George.
Yeah, because, first of all, there is a discussion amongst a lot of sinologists, really, about whether the more repressive, centralized approach to governance that has become his hallmark is a cause or effect of what's going on. So, there is a school of thought that says, that, he is a very repressive autocrat. If he only changed his ways, everything would be okay. That doesn't necessarily follow suit, because in some ways, the faltering of China's economic development model has triggered changes in governance and policy that increase the centre's control. And it's almost like it's compulsive to do that. Having said that, it's also true that Xi Jinping is a Leninist. He believes in centralization of control. He believes in the concentration of power. The party leads everything. This is not an idle phrase. They really mean it. Whether it's, family life or societal values or the business environment or, defense and security, the party leads everything. The state is in the sort of the commanding heights of the economy. I mean, this is an old kind of Maoist expression. But it's what he believes, and it's how he behaves.
So is this now where the rubber hits the road, in a way, where the growth, the economic growth of China is hitting this central control element, taking away the initiatives from the local government and the people? To what extent, I think I'm really asking is, does she think that he can make the Marxist-Leninist model work in the long term and create a wealthy China? And this is the experiment.
Yeah, clearly he does believe that. And,
You don't?
No, I don't.
Well, in my opinion, I don't think, whether he truly believes in the merits of this economic model, I don't think that's that important. Why? Because the centralization was not for him to, promote economic development, but rather for him to concentrate his political power. Right, so he obviously cared much more about the political concentration than economic development. Of course, I agree with what Yuka has been saying, that economic development has been a core legitimacy of the party, but compared with political dominance, that's not that important, right?
Yuka, do you think his experiment can work, given that China did the one-child policy experiment, the whole development experiment, and stunned the world in the way that it's grown up? Can this experiment work, of having Marxist-Leninism creating the wealthiest country in the world?
I think it's more going back to what was just expressed earlier, is that, I think the primary drivers for Xi decision making is primarily about political power. And I think this economic things come secondary and is an effect of what's happening politically. And I think that I would answer that question first by saying that it's really the question whether this kind of political sort of, reforms, like him taking the third term and concentration of power, how much of this can he go forward? Is there not going to be more pushback? How much of this political sort of, drive is, China going to be able to tolerate is really the question. I think it's less about economy. It's more about politics in terms of how far can she go with his political reforms. And I think that is actually a very kind of complicated question, and one that actually requires a lot of thought. And I'm happy to go into that, but I would say in a nutshell that it is actually a very fragile state, given if you look at, I mentioned earlier about the develop the West issue. We're not even touching upon other sort of issues around Tibet and all those kind of boundary areas, which kind of sees kind of the authority of, the CCP really being challenged in various kinds of political sort of expressions. So I think the question here is really about a political question first, and this economic thing comes second.
You want to jump in? Yeah.
Yuka mentioned the kind of magic phrase, political reforms. Because, if you look at the experience of Japan and other Asian tiger economies like Singapore, clearly, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Malaysia to a degree. I mean, these countries in many ways they have, as you said at the beginning, very comparable kind of development models, but they made a break. They basically gave the private sector its due, even if they have commitment to kind of strong, centralized, state enterprises and so on. Political reform actually was the key to unlocking the key to what economists call this middle income trap, which you find yourself basically stuck because of rigid institutions and the failure to reform politically. For Xi Jinping, the Communist Party is the raison d'etre for, its raison d'etre is to rule unchallenged and to basically fight off pressure for political...
So we're dealing here with a different mindset of legacy than Deng Xiaoping. Deng was to get rich is glorious, and whatever colour the cat is doesn't matter. With Xi, you have a different mindset there. And now I want to go on for our last few minutes that we've got here to look at what impact this has internationally. Because we've had the Xi, the wolf warrior, upping the threats against Taiwan, this different value system which we have sort of unpicked here, haven't we? Is that there is no sense in the leadership that this is going to emerge into a democratic, state like that. Yuka, you are the geopolitician amongst us. Tell us, give us your quick thoughts on that.
This is a very complex question, and I will actually focus in terms of what's happening in terms of norms. I think is really interesting, and I picked this idea of norms mainly because of this forum, which is about democracy forum, and I think essentially we're actually seeing Xi really carve out areas around digital authoritarianism, and economics around sort of like more controlled authoritarian ideas. And I think we're actually seeing really kind of fault lines started off by Xi, going back to what we talked about earlier with, supply chains and what he's doing in terms of industrial policy. I think that's actually sending sort of interesting kind of impact globally in terms of China's relationship with Russia, China's relationship with the developing global South, if you look at BRICS Plus.
Can I just jump in there? Because I just wanted this authoritarian nexus that we read about in the newspapers, is this a real thing? Or is it something that could fall apart at any moment and pragmatism takes over?
It's a very good question. I think, neither China nor Russia say they're authoritarian. If you look at a lot of the statements, they state that they're actually democratic. Yeah. So in terms of authoritarianism, I think a lot of scholars like to point to various tendencies that we see in the domestic sort of situation in China and also Russia, and link to normative positionings between these countries, which into a different governance systems that we see in the UK and the US and Europe. So I think it's one to be very cautious about the way in which we use the term authoritarianism. But two, if you look at areas even, like linked to economy, like, data governance, we have very different kind of ideas about how we can use data in sort of China domestically.
The whole thing, isn't it, sorry to interrupt, is about these two value systems. And if you underpin that with the human rights situation that we talk about, Xinjiang, that you mentioned, the threats against Taiwan. Jinsun, can you explain for us is that how can these bad scenarios happen when all of this technology is sort of China-based that we deal with, and China needs us, we need China. So is the mindset going to be one that leads us towards this war that you were talking about?
I'd rather think not. Like, for example, beyond this, we have to really think about one of the biggest global threats we have today is climate change.
You think that politicians will keep cool heads. Thank you, Yuka.
So you mentioned about the value. Obviously, the value in China is in conflict with the kind of a liberal democratic value we are holding firmly here in the West. But I wouldn't exaggerate the possible impact of value from China on the fate of the Western civilization, only because the soft power coming from the Chinese value is not that strong. It's not that popular here. What I worry more is the potential economic challenges posed by China or the China model on the Western economic situation, especially the job market. Right. So, for example, over the globalization period, you see that China is exporting deflation to all over the world, right? Because under the China model, the cheap Chinese labor can provide so many products so cheaply that it occupies so much job, accounts for so many job losses in the Western countries, and that has become a very fundamental issue. Why European Union and United States has to the protection exactly
and the trade wars
exactly
that we're likely
right
to see from.
right.
George Magnus, where does China sit in the minds of the Western citizen?
It's very sort of, I'm not sure that I can speak for the Western citizen, but I think that I honestly think that we are in a very kind of delicate situation where we could be wrong if we are overly cautious about China. We obviously would be wrong if we were overly negative about China. I think trying to strike the right balance is quite difficult. I think the economics that we've been speaking about in this discussion suggests to me that actually China will have its hands full, and I think the Western model, in my way of thinking, is actually more able to adapt and adjust to really, really trying and testing economic circumstances. I think the Chinese system is too rigid, and I don't think it can break out of it. But having said that, it's a $20 trillion economy. It is a world leader in a lot of very, very important technologies. And so it's not going to go away. It's obviously a huge military power, wants to be and is top dog in Asia anyway. And so the geopolitics and it's China's ability to use its kind of heft to exert geopolitical pressure, I think, is something we will continue. Western citizens, Western governments need to be continuously alert to and to try to defang if it's possible to do that.
Yuka, is the West handling China maturely and sensibly, or are we trying to create an unnecessary enemy out of it?
I think the West is doing the best it can, but I think you need to also unpack that over half of the world population is in the global South, and this is where China has a lot of attraction. So given the China model, given the Chinese technology, like if you look at the example of the African Union, despite the fact that you had a data leak going from the African Union building direct back to China, they decided to renew the Huawei technology to service the the African Union building. Meaning technology at very discounted rates were really appreciated by sort of the global South. So here, I think, the West needs to kind of understand their relations with China doesn't actually exist in a vacuum. The world is very wide. And where Chinese sort of economic models, China Dream actually has a lot of attraction in areas that the West does not. And I think, I'm always struck when I have this conversation about the Chinese economy in the, with sort of my African colleagues in sort of developing countries like, Burundi and etc. It's just really a different kind of discussion. And I think, when we're dealing with China, we need to kind of know that, yes, that we have big economies in the US and the UK and Europe, but essentially, things are really moving in terms of, the natural resources in the global south and how that's actually tied with important things like semiconductors and rare earths. So essentially, I think one needs to bear in mind the world is wider than just the UK.
Western China. George, you want to jump in?
I mean, all of that I think is true, Yuka, but there is an and yet, and yet, if you think about, the sort of the dynamic of what's playing out in the world economy at the moment, with this kind of push which the Chinese government is making to double down on manufacturing. Now, China already accounts for 32% of global manufacturing production, and 28% of China's economy is manufacturing. China cannot improve or increase its manufacturing exports, which is what it's trying to do with electric vehicles, batteries, solar, and so on. It can't do that without imposing costs on other countries. Now, obviously, the EU is kind of in the firing line on the electric vehicles. The United States obviously has its innate opposition to Chinese trade practices. But this is not just an EU and US thing. Brazil, Japan, Indonesia, other countries already kind of lodging kind of anti-dumping charges and anti-dumping practices against China. So, this is a kind of a sensitive area which is a repercussion of China's own exemplar policies.
Jump in.
I just want to add one point. I think George brought up this very important issue that China has adopted so many kind of what I call mercantilist policies, and that naturally imposes cost, economic and social and political cost to other countries, not just the EU and the United States. I think a urgent thing for the global policy leaders should think about is how to bring China back to this rule-based global system. For example, the labor practice in China has given China unfair advantages. Many people heard about the so-called 996 work culture, which means that the labor rights in China are very weakly respected and enforced, right? So that actually, again, under the China model, gives China this huge advantage, right?
On that issue, does China have a big enough seat on the table to determine any reform to the world order? Because it is saying that this is not our world order, therefore we don't recognize it anymore. Just very quickly.
I mean, this obviously requires a collective effort from all the rest of the world, right? So it cannot be done single-handedly by the United States, not single-handedly by the EU, right?
And that's the view of China at the moment.
Exactly.
In fact, there was a very interesting piece, I think, in Foreign Affairs recently about the definition of human rights, which China has always defined, and many countries define it differently to how we do. We're getting off the economy there. So what I'd like everybody to do in the past few minutes is give me a 1-minute summing up of the main fault line and what you have concluded from our debate. Firstly, we will go to Yuka Kobayashi.
I would actually like to answer this through the lens of world economic order. I think that the last comments were mainly around world order. What kind of world order are we having in terms of economic order? And this is kind of at the crux of the issue here, because given that we have a very troubled World Trade Organization, one that the United States actually under Trump really refused to appoint, appellate body members. So we're seeing kind of the world economic order in crisis and in flux as it is. And on the other hand, from China, we're actually seeing very different practices. We might label it authoritarian, we might label it like the Xi kind of economic policies, but we're seeing a different economic order emerge from China. Now, the interesting thing is it's very much at odds with what we're actually seeing in the West, but there are some kinds of support that we're actually seeing in the global South. And you can't just lump the global South as it is. You're actually seeing sort of different kinds of, positioning vis-a-vis China emerge, with Indonesia being much more kind of hard-hitting, and places like Myanmar and Cambodia more towards China. So I think one thing is really what we're seeing the fault lines emerge in economies in China domestically is very much mirrored in this idea about world economic order. And where that world economic order is going is geopolitically very complex and also one that's challenged by what's happening inside China. And I think I'm up to my 1 minute, so I'll leave my comments here.
Maybe the world economic order itself is the fault line. George Magnus.
So, I mean, I think the fault line is the economy, because China's heft in the world wouldn't be what it is were it not for the fact that it has been, growing like gangbusters until a few years ago and is a $20 trillion economy. I mean, obviously, India is very important. It's very big, very populous, but it isn't a $20 trillion economy, and it lacks the heft that China has. So, if China's economy is going to be compromised for all of the reasons that we've been talking about, and that its new productive forces strategy and everything associated with that is going to have costs and consequences for others, then I think that is a new fault line, which is a product of the old one in a way. I mean, the old model isn't working. This is a new way that Xi Jinping would like to get round it, but it has its own contradictions as well.
Yes. Jinsun, you started us, so you can finish us.
Okay. It's a great honor to actually draw some conclusion remarks. So I will go back to what I raised initially. The major fault line, in my opinion, is this what I call premature stagnation in productivity growth. So the question I got asked recently is that whether China can avoid this Japanese-style stagnation or deflation for the lost decades, or China can quickly reboot its economic growth. I think, here China has a great potential given the current level of development, but to realize this potential, very bold economic and political reforms will be needed in both short run and in the long run. I think in the short run, the priority must be, China faces this downward cycle of deflation. And if that trajectory goes down and down, then it's really difficult to get rid of it, as George mentioned early on. So I think some very loose monetary policy, very bold cutting of interest rate, and in combination with fiscal expansion will be needed to jump China, out of this deflationary cycle. This is a big lesson we have learned from the 1990s Japan. But in the long run, remember that I mentioned the two pillars of the China model is one, developmental state, which is still there, but the second is the private sector. Currently, the private sector in China is losing confidence. They're not
that's
making.
The key, isn't it?
That's the key. They're no longer committed to making additional investment. They're not innovating because they feel like their property rights will not be respected. Right? Of course, the government made here and there a lot of pledges, but whether that will be credible. So this will bring back to the major topic we mentioned earlier on about political reforms. I'm not saying we definitely need democracy. Of course, democracy and the rule of law are ideal, just to echo the topic of this forum in general. But even some limited political reforms that impose effective checks and balances against the government behavior will actually boost the confidence among the private entrepreneurs.
That is a very good point. And we have got 1 minute left, so I'm going to come back for you all because I mentioned that pact between the citizens, which you've just mentioned, the citizen and the government. Let us say, for sake of argument, that when Deng's reforms were happening, it was 100%. What is it now? Yuka, how much do the citizen trust the governments to deliver for them?
Ooh, tough question.
It's just got a numerical answer.
But it depends on what strata of the population. It's a very difficult question.
Are you passing? Okay, George.
Yeah. I mean, I think the legitimacy is compromised, right, and will be, but I don't necessarily think that change in China is going to come from the streets. I think it'll come from within the party.
But the level of trust,
I mean, what we know about the Lie Flat movement, the Let It Rot movement, all of this kind of social movements say that people have, or young people in particular, have lost trust in the government.
Would you like to put a figure on it, Jinsun?
Well, I don't know. It depends on whether you want to hear about the figures in the survey or figures in people's impression.
Figures that you have. In your head.
I would definitely agree with George that the people's trust in both the government and the government's capacity to steer the economic in a better direction has been compromised, especially after the pandemic, after the dramatic crackdown against the real estate and the job losses Yuka mentioned earlier.
Okay. Yeah. What an insightful Democracy Forum debate we've had. I feel much wiser as to where those fault lines lie in China's economic policies. Thank you, Jinsun, George Magnus, Yuka Kobayashi, and thanks too to Lord Charles Bruce for setting the scene for us. Please check our sister publication, Asian Affairs, which explores areas of the Indo-Pacific that's not much covered by the mainstream media, and check out the Democracy Forum website for our next upcoming debates. But until next time, from all of us at Democracy Forum, thank you for being with us and goodbye.
Thank you.